Hey, I'm David Adelsheim. The story of Adelsheim Vineyard began in 1971. That was the year that Ginny and I decided to risk our life savings on a piece of property in Oregon's North Willamette Valley. Looking back now, we were one of just 10 families that made wine before 1980 from grapes planted on our properties in that region. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of what became our first vineyard, we wanted to tell our story. But we quickly realized that the only way to truly tell our story was to tell the stories of that entire first generation. Our winery team proposed an idea, a series of video conversations with the founders of those first 10 wineries and me. I loved it and set to work contacting my old friends. In each interview, we wanted to go beyond their widely known histories to discover who these people really were and what led them to build our uniquely collaborative, and at least from today's perspective, incredibly successful wine industry. This is our shared story. Our final interview in this series was with Ginny Adelsheim. Ginny and I spent the summer of 1969 in Europe, unconsciously looking for direction in our lives. We were inspired by the foods we ate and the wines that were served. When we got back to Portland, those things remained important to us. After a year and a half, with Ginny finishing her BA, me working in a bank, we realized we needed to get closer to the land and the food we ate. Little did we know that our quest for a place in the country would lead us into wine and the discovery of our future. On October 5th, 2020, Ginny and I talked on the terrace outside the home we built in 1971, which sits on top of our original winery. Well, Ginny, here we are at what's now called the Quarter Mile Lane Vineyard, although it wasn't when we first found it and bought it. Obviously, we've known each other since 65, I think. Was there something either prior to that or in the years between 65 and 71 that prepared you for what happened in 71?
Wow.
I know.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
But if I can go back all the way to my childhood, I think there were things that went on in my early years that definitely had an impact on me deciding that I could do this. I grew up in a family where both my parents were very cognizant of nature. My dad loved to camp and took us camping every summer. And my mother was not as outdoorsy, but she had a great love of nature and taught us all about the different trees and plants and
she
mushrooms.
Knew every plant.
She knew all the names. Plus, I think one of the most significant things was the fact that she read Rachel Carson. The very first books she wrote were about the sea. She wrote 3 books about the sea, and then she wrote Silent Spring. Right. And she read those books to us. So I grew up already having an awareness of our impact on the planet. So that was foundational in my approach to all of this. You know, whatever we did, we needed to be doing it with respect for nature.
Was there wine in your family? I mean,
No.
Did you drink wine?
Never, no. My dad liked to come home and have some scotch after work. But once we got into the wine business, remember, he started drinking wine.
Yeah.
There was one other thing that I think was really important for me and my attitude toward living in the country, and that was that my grandmother, my mother's mother, grew up on a homestead in Indiana, and she was an artist and a writer and wrote all these little stories about her childhood on the homestead and illustrated these stories. They were true stories. And she died when I was just a year old, so I never knew her, but my mother made sure I knew who she was and read these stories to us. So I had a great romantic vision of living in the country and what it would be like to grow your own food and have chickens and ducks and all that. And and so that was a really important thing I had in my head always.
We got married. I went to Korea for the Army. You went for as an unaccompanied whatever it was officially called. And when I got out of the Army, I did it in Korea, and we went to Japan, and then we went to Eastern Russia and took the Trans-Siberian Express all the way to Moscow. 8 days of hell.
Not all. It was kind of amazing, actually.
Yeah, it was. But spent the summer in Europe that year. And do you have specific memories of that trip having anything to do with wine?
Yes, and food. Those two really went hand in hand for me. My first memory of really thinking about food in a different way was when we were in Moscow, actually. we'd lived in Korea for a year and a half at that point, and so I hadn't been eating Western food really for quite a while, or it was sort of quasi.
Yeah.
And when we were in Moscow, one night we went to dinner, and I'll never forget this dinner we had. It was incredible. There were these little tiny puff pastry shells with tiny petit pois in them, and stuff like that. And it was like, wow. And then we had a bed and breakfast in Berlin with the two gay men who were fabulous cooks. And we'd have these phenomenal breakfasts, with just this repast in front of us and little egg cups with on and on. But then the thing that I remember the most that really knocked my socks off was when we went to Switzerland and stayed with Aunt Nellie. This was, you remember her. She was the aunt of Louisette, who we knew in Korea.
Right.
And Louisette had said, well, go see Aunt Nellie when you're in Switzerland. So we drove up to her apartment, tiny little place, and she greeted us at the door and invited us in and fixed us the most amazing little dinner. It was an apple pancake, I believe, that she cooked in one pan. And this was a woman that was probably my age, 75. And she flipped the cake up into the air and caught it in the pan. And then she went outside and snipped some herbs, and she had, by the back steps, and made this lovely little, it was a potato soup with these, chives and parsley in it. And it was so simple, and it was so good. It was like, gosh, why haven't I done that? And so when we came back, I was all gung-ho. And you too, we were both really excited about food and wine. And
I do remember the wine that we had with that meal, which was a Beaujolais.
Wow, I don't remember that at all.
No, I mean, it's the kind of crazy things.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I would say, yes, that trip was really an eye-opener for me about food and wine.
Moving from Portland, which was the thing that led to us buying this piece of property, was initially about moving out of the city.
Yes.
Was that in some way sort of getting at the fantasy from your mother's mother?
Yeah. I remember saying, we ought to move to the country and build a house. It was like, okay, how do we do that? And so we did. We started looking for land right after I got through at Contemporary Crafts. When I was at Contemporary Crafts, Susan Blosser, she brought Diana Lett to the studio, and I met Diana, and we'd already met Susan and Bill.
Okay.
And that's why Susan brought her to meet me. And I just remember when I met Diana, I just wanted to be her friend. I fell in love with her, I think. It was love at first sight. No, she became a great friend and still is.
Yeah.
And she helped me so much through those early years because she, if Diana can do it with all she has on her plate, I certainly can.
Yeah. Before we found out that people had planted wine grapes, the fantasy was just about having studios, wasn't it?
Once we found the property and the foundation was already here, 30 by 60 feet. And the four of us designed this house that was like a hotel. Remember that? The whole 60 feet. And then it was 3 stories, and we took it down to get our building permit, and the guy said, I think you're going to be paying a lot of taxes on this house. You better make it. That's why we have this flat roof. So we ended up with a 40-foot long house, 3 stories. And we built that, or we're building it. I was perfectly happy to grow grapes, because initially we were talking about, the 4 of us were talking about growing grapes for our own little winery where we could make enough wine for all of us. But then in the process of looking for land was when we came in contact with David and Diana, and of course the Eraths and the Sokol Blossers. And that was when you got the bee in your bonnet that this could be much more than just some wine for us. And that was, I think, why we chose this property at that point, because we wanted more land. We needed more land to make it a commercial venture. But we still stuck with the idea of the 4 studios and...
Right. Early in our joining the wine industry, it was 4 of us who were here. Rita was your longtime friend. Mm-hmm. Paul was first her whatever, and then her husband. Explain who they were, how they were part of this, and...
Well, Rita and I went to high school together, and then when I moved out of my folks' house, she and I rented a place in Portland while I was at Portland State. And we lived in the same house together with Barbara and Bob Pickett. Right. And then after we came back from Korea, we got connected again with Rita and Paul. I think they were together by then. And we lived in the duplex, and we were all doing our thing, artistically.
And they were part of the search for land, and we were going to, in essence, build a duplex.
Right.
And just continue what we were doing in Portland. Once we moved into this house, a year later they got married. And then in '74, which was 2 years after that, they got divorced.
Right, and left.
They were out of the whole
picture
at that point.
That's right.
And that left us with a
big job.
A big job and a big house and a big commitment that we had made to this place that we somehow had to carry on. So the chronology is 71, we bought this property on June 4th, which is the 50th anniversary that we're celebrating and doing all these about. We built this house that year and actually moved in.
No windows, no insulation, no sheetrock, of course, no flooring. We had some subflooring, no stairs, ladders only.
Were any of the other founders, in your mind, much richer than we were?
Oh gosh, I don't really think of any of us as being rich.
No.
Our living conditions were a little compromised compared to other people because we were building our own house and we never had enough money to get it finished, or time, more importantly maybe even. Plus we had to work. You were working in restaurants, you were at L'Omelette, and I was at Crepe Fair and trying to be an artist. As
you said, you were a ceramic artist, you were trying to do that as well. What was your role in our wine business and in the wine business? Everything.
In the first years, we both did everything. We planted and we built. I learned how to do all the various things that one does in a winery. And in 1980, I actually ran Crush because you were gone. And I learned how to prune and pull brush and all that stuff. And we were actually making wine. That totally changed our existence too, because at that point we were into marketing. And so I was doing some distribution. I'd take, down, I'd go south to Salem and Corvallis and Eugene. and we had wine tastings here, and I'd have to completely redo the house and make it into a wine tasting facility. My friends thought that was amazing, actually. I learned quickly that I didn't want to have any furniture that I couldn't move myself. And we put on dinners, and that was really important too. Even though we didn't have a fancy place, we had a lot of really important people come through here in those early years.
One of the things that is emerging as I've talked to these 10 families is, in a more sexist time, which the 1970s really was, the role of women was, one, less defined vis-a-vis wine. I mean, a lot of these conversations were driven by the male part of the couple, particularly when it came to winemaking. Did you remember having conversations with other women, either in Yamhill County or more generally, about this at that time?
Well, mainly in the context of the role that we just assumed out of necessity, which had a lot to do with entertaining and making the wine industry a hospitable industry for people that came here to find out about us. That was a very important role that we all played. I think most of my contributions were artistic, because that was really those were the skills that I had to offer.
How you used your art for our business?
Well, once we had wine and we had to think about how to sell it, that was when I thought about drawing people, because that's what I could do. I'd done a lot of portraiture, so it made sense to draw somebody. This was the very first label I drew, which was a black and white drawing, actually. It was just a graphite pencil drawing, and then the color was, added later. Yeah. But it's not a person that I know, it was just a fantasy face. And it was supposed to be a vineyard spirit, something like that. And it has grapes growing along the top of the label, and I always was very careful to do the botanically correct drawing of the vine.
So that's a Semillon vine.
That's a Semillon vine. The Merlot was the first actual portrait I drew, and that's of my oldest dear friend, Connie Keener, and who lived with us. She and her daughter lived with us for 2 years, and during that time, I had, she was my captive model, so I drew her for the first Merlot label.
What was your thinking that you should do a different person on the second label?
You
Did
were
I
the
tell
thinking.
You had to do that?
You always wanted a new face for every wine, don't you remember? I was kidding. I used up every one of my friends and their daughters. And how many labels did we do?
A lot.
Okay, this is the time I whip out the card and show you how many labels. These are more or less all of the portraits. And that's the vineyard portrait, winter.
Yep.
But there's Semillon, there's the Merlot. Here's the Merlot original drawing, so you can see what it looked like before it was in color. Oops. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. More from that to being more full color with the Rita label and the famous Diana label.
As I recall, you were interested in full color. And I had never really thought in color because I don't think in color. And I was just interested in doing these sort of, one color drawings. And but you convinced me that we should go into the color thing. And so I decided that these labels, where there was a portrait and the vineyard in the background, should reflect those old fruit, turn of the century fruit labels. If you remember, they often had a portrait of the fruit, like a big peach in the foreground, and then there would be this beautiful orchard, going off into the distance. And all the people that I used that I did portraits of had a connection to the winery, to our business somehow. And Barbara and Bob, of course, lived with us for a year. And she and I laid out the whole Chardonnay block ourselves. And Diana, of course, because she and David are the founders of the industry. So that was my thank you to them.
How much of what came of this business is an outgrowth of your grandmother's stories and the fantasies that you built around country living? How much of it was fulfilled by that, and how much of it was an entirely new life that you could not have fantasized?
Well, I don't think that the homestead life, which is all that my grandmother ever knew, was really anything like what we did. But it was what propelled me to want to take a leap to go to the country. Because she was a little girl, you know, riding horses bareback and making soap and I don't know, all that sort of thing. And, you know, we ended up buying land to make a commercial, a business, which is totally different. And it required a kind of discipline and sacrifice that I couldn't have imagined. And not that there's anything wrong with that, it was just totally different. And everything we did, we learned on the job, at least I did, pretty much.
Well, I think the industry did in a certain sense. How much of that was, in essence, group learning of you, us, others in the industry? And how much of it did you, in essence, have to figure out yourself?
Well, I think it was all those things. I don't know how to qualify or separate it, because we were all learning individually, but we were also constantly having to interact to figure out stuff. You know, you were constantly in touch with David and Dick and Dick Ponzi and all of those people, because all of it was being figured out for the first time. I mean, I remember days and days of you poring over those topographical maps, trying to figure out all the places you could possibly grow grapes in the hill, in Willamette Valley, and working really hard to get the labeling laws changed and things like that, which were really not for us personally so much as for the industry, and it influenced not just Oregon but other places.
Yeah.
So, but I was definitely trying to learn everything I could as we were doing it.
Were you, I mean, all of this was going on in the day before the internet, so you couldn't look up anything without going to a library or buying a book or
Right.
somehow doing whatever. Were there research projects that you ended up having to get into in some sense in order to solve an issue or a problem?
Having to do with wine?
Yeah.
No. That was really your job. I was trying to still do, work on the house and be an artist, because I was still having shows.
Right.
And doing a little bit of teaching. I taught one term. I taught at Portland State for a term because Ray Grimm went on sabbatical, and I taught at PCC, and I had one or two shows every year of my artwork. So, you asked me earlier what was one of the jobs I had that wasn't art related. And I would say one of the jobs that wasn't ever, I didn't have it on a job description or anything, but I really was a liaison between the employees and you. Because you were really busy, and a lot of times you were not here because you were traveling. And so I sort of became the go-between, and that actually was a really important role, because they'd come to me and say, I need this or that, or whatever, and then
Right.
One of the issues that has always been important to me was how the industry affects the environment. And as we grew, as the Oregon wine industry grew, I became more and more distressed because I realized this was a huge thing that was happening in Oregon, and many, many areas of the countryside were being put into grapes, and I was thinking, oh my God, are we going to have another monoculture? What's happening? Oh no, these fences are going up. How are the wild animals going to be able to find the corridors to get up and down the mountain? Those were things that really upset me, and for a while there, I didn't feel like there was enough concern about it, but I am happy to say that now I see a totally different attitude where people in the industry are much more, and a lot of it is the second generation, because they've grown up with a realization of the environment and how critical it is that we change some of our practices and really be good stewards. When it was an idea, a concept, and we were able to create what we wanted without any prior influence, really, at least not in Oregon. That was so freeing, just to see what we could do and not have to worry that, oh my God, that person already did it or they did it better. That was a wonderful thing. Plus, there were so few of us that we really had a kind of familial camaraderie in the way that we approached everything. And I don't think it's easy to do that when industry gets to be so big.
Thank you for coming out and exploring the period of 40 and 50 years ago, which was so obviously transformative for our lives, but I think is expressed, I think it's not too extreme to say that there are expressions of what we helped create back then that one still sees today in the wine industry. Yeah.
I'll drink to that.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.